The roar of the engines filled the cabin, a deep, vibrating hum that most passengers had learned to tune out. But for Daniel Carter, that sound would soon become the soundtrack of his nightmares. He sat by the window, absent-mindedly watching. The clouds rolled past, his fingers tapping against the armrest. It was supposed to be a routine flight, one he had taken dozens of times before. Yet within moments, everything would change. The sudden jolt of turbulence sent a murmur of concern through the passengers. Flight attendants exchanged wary glances, their polite smiles faltering. And then, without warning, the plane lurched violently. The overhead compartments burst open, belongings tumbling down as the cabin lights flickered. The sound of metal groaning under pressure filled the air. A voice crackled over the intercom, the captain's tone strained but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing an emergency." The rest of his words were swallowed by a deafening explosion. Chaos erupted. Oxygen masks dropped from above, swinging like pendulums, as people fumbled to secure them. Screams blended with the furious howling of the wind as the aircraft pitched downward. Daniel's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. He gripped the armrests, his knuckles white. The world outside spun wildly, a dizzying blur of sky and earth. In that moment, time seemed to stretch, every second etched into his mind with terrifying clarity. A mother clutching her child, a man whispering a prayer, a flight attendant bracing herself, her eyes squeezed shut. And then impact. Darkness swallowed everything. There was no pain, no sound, just an eerie silence that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, a faint ringing in his ears. A slow return to consciousness. He was alive. Somehow, against all odds, Daniel Carter had survived. His body ached, his vision blurred, but he was breathing. The wreckage of the plane lay around him, twisted, metal and shattered glass. Fires crackled in the distance, illuminating the night with an eerie glow. Groans of pain echoed through the wreckage, proof that he wasn't alone. The cold air stung his skin as he struggled to move, his limbs protesting with every shift. His mind raced. How had he survived? And more importantly, where was everyone else? He forced himself to his feet, scanning the devastation. Survivors were scattered among the wreckage, some crying, some too stunned to speak. And then, a sound that sent a chill down his spine, the distant wail of sirens. Rescue was coming. But Daniel knew this was only the beginning. He had faced death and walked away. But fate wasn't done with him yet. Because what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that this wouldn't be the last time he would stare death in the face. Daniel stood amidst the wreckage, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The cold night air bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was still reeling, struggling to process the impossible reality around him. The plane was gone, scattered, in torn metal and burning debris. The voices of the other survivors blended with the distant wail of sirens, but everything felt distant, as if he was stuck in a dream, unable to wake up. His fingers trembled as he ran them over his arms, his chest, checking for injuries. Scrapes, bruises, a deep gash on his forearm, but nothing life-threatening. He was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive. The night stretched on, an agonizing blur of flashing lights, hurried footsteps, and hushed voices. Paramedics moved through the wreckage, assessing injuries, carrying survivors away on stretchers. Daniel sat on the ground, his back against a piece of twisted metal, watching it, all in a daze. He should have been relieved, grateful. But something gnawed at the edges of his mind, a feeling he couldn't shake. Survival wasn't supposed to feel like this, so hollow, so unreal. He glanced around, searching for familiar faces. There had been people sitting around him on the flight. Where were they now? Had they made it? A paramedic knelt beside him, shining, a small flashlight into his eyes. "You're lucky," she said, her voice kind but edged with disbelief. Can you stand?" He nodded slowly, though his legs felt unsteady beneath him. As she helped him to his feet, he took in the full scale of the destruction. Flames flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows over the torn earth. The tail of the plane lay twisted against a row of trees, barely recognizable. Smoke curled into the air, thick and acrid. But what struck him the most was the silence in between the moments when no one spoke, when only the wind moved through the wreckage, carrying whispers of what had just happened. A low voice broke through his thoughts. "Carter." He turned sharply. A man stood a few feet away, his face partially obscured by the dim light. Broad shoulders, a strong jaw, eyes that held something unreadable. Daniel frowned. "Do I know you?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "No, but I know you." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You were in seat 14A. Daniel's chest tightened. "Yeah?" The man nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. "So was I." A shiver ran through Daniel, though he wasn't sure why. Something about the way the man said it, the way he looked at him, made the air feel heavier. Before he could say anything, the paramedics ushered them toward the waiting ambulances. The man gave him one last look before stepping away, disappearing into the chaos. Daniel barely slept that night. Even after the hospital had checked him over and cleared him to leave, even after he collapsed onto his hotel bed, exhaustion pressing down on him, his mind wouldn't let go. He kept hearing the sound of the engines, the snap of metal tearing apart, kept seeing the man's face, his unreadable expression. Why had he pointed out their seat numbers? What did it mean? Morning came too soon, sunlight spilling through the curtains. Daniel sat up slowly, his muscles aching with the reminder that last night had been real. He reached for his phone, scrolling through news headlines. Miracle survival. Dozens walk. Away from catastrophic plane crash. Experts stunned by unbelievable survivors' accounts. The articles all said the same thing: mechanical failure, a rapid descent, a devastating impact. But one thing stood out. Aviation experts baffled by the survival rate. Nearly all passengers from the main cabin survived the crash, while first class and cockpit areas suffered devastating losses. Daniel's stomach twisted. It didn't make sense. Plane crashes didn't work like that. There was no reason the front half should have been obliterated while the rest remained intact. And yet, here he was. A sharp knock at his door made him jump. He hesitated before opening it. Standing there was the same man from last night. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. Daniel swallowed. He should have said no. Should have asked why this stranger was seeking him out. But instead he stepped aside, letting him in. The man shut the door behind him, his gaze steady. "My name's Mark," he said. "Mark Hensley. I need to talk to you." Daniel folded his arms. "About what?" Mark exhaled slowly. "About what happened last night, and about what's going to happen next." A chill ran through Daniel. "What do you mean? What's going to happen next?" Mark's jaw tightened. "That was my second plane crash." Daniel felt the world tilt slightly. "What?" Mark nodded, his eyes dark, serious. "You heard me. Second crash. First one was 8 years ago. Different airline, different flight, same kind of impossible survival." Daniel's pulse pounded. "That doesn't just happen." Mark gave a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, that's what I thought too." He leaned in. "Tell me something, Carter. Did you feel it?" Daniel's mouth went dry. "Feel what?" Mark studied him carefully before answering. The moment before impact. When everything slowed down. When it felt like something shifted. Daniel's breath caught, because he had felt it. A strange stillness, a weight pressing down on him just before the crash, as if something unseen had wrapped around him, shielding him from what should have been certain death. Mark saw the realization in his eyes. He nodded. "It's not luck, Carter. It never was." Daniel swallowed hard. Then what is it? Mark's expression darkened. That's what I've been trying to figure out. And if I'm right? He glanced toward the door, lowering his voice. This isn't over. A heavy silence settled between them. Daniel's mind raced, grasping for logic, for reason. But deep down, he already knew this was bigger than just a crash, bigger than coincidence. And somehow, he was at the center of it. He just didn't know why. Daniel stared at Mark, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. The words hung heavy in the air. This isn't over. A cold, creeping unease settled into his bones. Everything about last night had been impossible. But the idea that it wasn't just luck, that there was something else at play, made his skin prickle. He wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to coincidence or paranoia. But deep down, a part of him already knew the truth. He had felt it. That strange stillness before impact, that unnatural sense of control, like something had decided he wasn't supposed to die. Mark sat down on the edge of the bed, rubbing a hand over his face. After my first crash, I thought it was a fluke, he said. Everyone did. Investigators couldn't explain how some of us walked away without a scratch. But I kept feeling like something wasn't right. Like I'd missed something. He looked up at Daniel. Then it happened again. Last night. His voice dropped. And now you. Daniel shook his head, his pulse pounding. This doesn't make sense. People don't just survive plane crashes twice. Mark let out a dry laugh. Tell me about it. He leaned forward. Look, I don't have all the answers, but I know one thing: there's a pattern. I started digging after my first crash, looking into other so-called miracle survivors. And guess what? Some of them had been in crashes before, too. Daniel frowned. You're saying this has happened to other people? Mark nodded. Not many, but enough. And it's not random. Every single one of them survived against the odds. No explanation, no logic, just impossible luck. His gaze hardened. Until they didn't. A chill ran through Daniel. What do you mean? Mark hesitated, as if deciding how much to say. A few years after my first crash, I found someone else like me, a woman named Rachel. She'd survived 2 disasters, one in the air, one on a sinking ferry. Just like me, she felt like something had saved her, like she was supposed to survive. He swallowed. Then one night, she called me. Said she thought someone was following her, watching her. She was terrified. He exhaled slowly. A week later, she was gone. Car accident. And not just any accident, one that didn't make sense. She was found in her car, no skid marks, no signs of impact, like she just stopped. Daniel's stomach twisted. You think she was killed? Mark's jaw tightened. I think whatever saved her stopped. Silence stretched between them. Daniel's thoughts raced, colliding into each other in a mess of fear and confusion. The idea was insane. But after what he had been through, was it really any crazier than surviving a plane crash with barely a scratch? A sudden knock at the door made both of them jump. Mark was on his feet instantly, his expression sharp. Daniel hesitated before moving toward the door, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. When he opened it, a woman stood there, her dark eyes scanning him with quiet intensity. She wore a gray jacket, a small bag slung over her shoulder. Her posture, tense like someone who had been looking over her shoulder for too long. Daniel Carter? She asked, her voice low. He hesitated. Who's asking? She glanced past him, her gaze locking onto Mark. Something flickered in her expression. Recognition. You're Hensley. Mark didn't look surprised. And you are? She stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. Emily Navarro. I was on your flight. Daniel's breath caught. Another survivor. Emily folded her arms, her gaze flicking between them. I need to know if either of you felt it. Mark and Daniel exchanged a look. Emily exhaled sharply. I knew it. I knew I wasn't crazy. She started pacing, her movements tight, restless. The second the plane started going down, I felt it, like everything slowed. Like I was outside of my body watching it happen. Her voice dropped. And then I just knew I wasn't going to die. Daniel felt a cold wave of recognition wash over him. That was exactly how it had felt. Not just blind luck, not just hope certainty. Mark's expression darkened. How did you find us? Emily hesitated. I overheard the paramedics talking about survivors who were miraculously unharmed. Then I heard your name, Hensley. I looked you up. She turned to Daniel. And then I found you. Daniel swallowed hard. Why? Her jaw clenched. Because if we all felt the same thing, then that means it wasn't just luck. Her eyes burned with something between fear and determination. It means something is choosing who lives and who doesn't. The room went silent. Mark finally spoke, his voice grim. If that's true, then we need to find out why. Daniel nodded slowly, but a deep unease curled in his gut. Because if something had decided to save them, what happened when it changed its mind? A heavy silence filled the room as Emily's words settled between them. Something was choosing who lived. Daniel's mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but no logic could explain what they had experienced. His body still carried the memory of the crash, the certainty that he should have died. And yet, here he was. Here they all were. Mark exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. If we're right about this, he said, then we're not just lucky survivors. We're something else. His voice dropped. And if something saved us, that means it can stop saving us. Daniel's stomach tightened. The thought had already crossed his mind, but hearing it out loud made it real. The eerie pattern, the strange disappearances. Was it only a matter of time before their luck ran out? Emily paced the room, her mind clearly working through the same terrifying possibilities. We need answers, she said. Someone has to know what's happening to us. Mark nodded. I've spent years looking into this. Survivors like us, patterns. There aren't many of us, but the ones who survive multiple disasters, they don't just disappear, they die. Accidents, sudden health failures, freak incidents that don't add up. He looked at Emily. Rachel thought she was being watched before she died. Have you noticed anything off? Emily hesitated. She stopped, her expression shifting. Wait. She pulled out her phone, swiping quickly. A few hours ago, I got a weird notification. Someone tried to access my email from an unknown device. I thought it was just spam, but now... She trailed off, her jaw tightening. Daniel felt a cold prickle down his spine. Someone's tracking us. Mark's eyes darkened. Then we need to move. Now. Daniel didn't argue. A sense of urgency clawed at him. If someone or something was watching them, staying in one place was a mistake. They gathered what little they had and slipped out the back entrance of the hotel. The night air was sharp, laced with the faint scent of rain. The city hummed around them, cars passing, distant voices, the steady glow of streetlights. It felt normal. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. They moved, quickly, weaving through side streets, keeping to the shadows. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, her grip tightening on her phone. If someone is following us, what do they want? She whispered. Mark's expression was grim. Control. Daniel frowned. Control over what? Mark stopped walking, turning to face them. Think about it. If some force has the ability to decide who survives impossible situations, what else can they control? Daniel's pulse pounded. You think we were saved for a reason? Mark nodded. And if that's true, then maybe they don't like that we're asking questions. Emily's phone vibrated, making them all jump. She glanced down, then paled. "No way!" She turned the screen toward them, a single text message. "Stop looking." The three of them stood frozen. The street suddenly felt too quiet, too exposed. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. "We need to get off the grid." Mark's jaw tightened. "I know a place." They moved fast, slipping into the subway, boarding a near-empty train, heading out of the city. The tension was suffocating. Every time the doors slid open, Daniel expected to see someone step in, someone watching them, waiting. By the time they reached their stop, rain had started to fall. Mark led them through back streets until they reached an abandoned warehouse, its windows dark, its metal doors rusted with time. "No one will find us here," he said. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The dim glow of Emily's phone cast, long shadows on the walls. Mark sat down, pulling out a worn notebook. "Everything I've found, every theory, every survivor I've tracked, it's all in here." His fingers traced over a name. "There's one person left, one survivor who's still alive." Daniel leaned in. "Who?" Mark met his eyes. "A man named Vincent Hale." Emily's breath hitched. "Wait, I know that name. He was the sole survivor of a cruise ship accident years ago." Mark nodded. "And then, just like us, he survived a plane crash." He exhaled. "I've been trying to find him for months. He vanished off the radar." Daniel's chest tightened. "So if he's still alive," Mark's voice was low, "then he might be the only one who can tell us what's really happening." A sharp noise cut through the silence footsteps outside. They froze. Emily's phone buzzed again. A new message. Too late. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. Outside, the footsteps grew louder. Whoever or whatever was watching them had found them. The footsteps outside were slow, deliberate. Each step sent a pulse of fear through Daniel's chest. The warehouse walls felt too thin, the shadows too shallow to hide them. Emily's phone buzzed again in her trembling hand, but no one dared to look. Mark motioned for them to stay silent, his fingers tightening around the notebook, as if it held the only answers that mattered. The footsteps stopped. The air was thick with silence. Daniel's breath was shallow, his pulse roaring in his ears. Thina knock. Not a pounding fist, not the aggressive thud of someone forcing their way in, just a single, measured knock. Emily clutched Daniel's arm, her grip like ice. "They know we're here," she whispered. Mark motioned for them to stay. Back, then slowly crept toward the door. Daniel wanted to stop him, wanted to tell him this was a mistake, but fear held him frozen. Another knock. Then a voice low, calm and terrifyingly certain. "Open the door. We need to talk." Mark hesitated, his fingers hovering over the handle. Then, before he could decide, the door unlocked itself. Daniel's stomach dropped. He saw it happen, the deadbolt sliding open on its own, the latch clicking back as if an invisible hand had moved it. Mark stumbled back, his face pale. The door creaked open an inch. A man stood on the other side, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. He stepped forward, revealing sharp, intelligent eyes and an unsettlingly calm expression. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes that blended into the night. But it wasn't his appearance that made Daniel's skin crawl. It was the way he looked at them, like he already knew everything. "You're making a mistake," the man said. His voice was smooth, controlled. "You're asking the wrong questions." Emily found her voice first. "Who are you?" The man's eyes flickered to her, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Someone who understands what's happening to you." Daniel swallowed hard. "And what exactly is happening to us?" The man stepped inside, moving, with a quiet confidence that sent every instinct in Daniel's body screaming. He didn't ask for permission, he just walked in, as if he already belonged there. You weren't saved by luck, the man said. His gaze landed on Mark's notebook. You already know that, but what you don't know is why. Mark's grip tightened on the notebook. Then tell us. The man studied him for a long moment, then finally spoke. Because you weren't supposed to survive. The words sent a cold wave through Daniel. He felt Emily tense beside him, saw Mark's knuckles turn white. The man's eyes darkened. Do you understand what that means? Daniel's throat was dry. No. The man took a slow step closer. It means you disrupted something. A thick silence filled the space. Mark was the first to speak. What do you mean, disrupted? The man exhaled, his gaze heavy. Life has rules. People don't just survive things they shouldn't. When someone dies, it means something. But you, his eyes swept over them. You were meant to be part of a sequence, and now that sequence is broken. Daniel's chest tightened. Then why did we survive? The man tilted his head slightly, considering. Because something intervened. Mark's jaw clenched. Who? The man's expression darkened. That's the question, isn't it? Emily took a step forward, her fear edged with defiance. If we weren't supposed to survive, then why does it matter now? What happens? Next? The man held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said something that made Daniel's blood turn to ice. The world is trying to fix the mistake. A heavy silence followed. Mark shook his head. What does that mean? The man's voice was quiet. It means it's coming for you. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. What is? The man's expression remained unreadable. Call it balance. Call it fate. Call it whatever makes you sleep at night. But understand this, no one escapes it forever. Emily's breathing was unsteady. So we're just supposed to accept that we're doomed? The man glanced toward the door, as if sensing something they couldn't. You still have time. His gaze settled on Daniel. But not much. Daniel's stomach twisted. Why me? For the first time, the man hesitated. Then he exhaled. Slowly. Because you weren't just saved. He took another step closer, lowering his voice. You were chosen. Daniel felt like the ground had just dropped beneath him. Mark stepped forward. Chosen by who? The man's expression darkened. By whatever broke the sequence in the first place. Emily's voice was barely a whisper. And what happens if the sequence isn't fixed? The man glanced at her, then at the darkened doorway behind him. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. Then everything changes. A sudden bang echoed through the warehouse. The lights flickered. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. The air grew heavy, suffocating. The man turned sharply toward the door. His jaw tightened. It's already here. Daniel's pulse pounded. What is? The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step backward toward the door, his expression unreadable. You need to run. The shadows deepened. The air pressed in. The walls seemed to hum, vibrating with something unseen, and then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed. The room. The air felt thick, charged with something unseen. Daniel's breath came in short gasps as his fingers dug into the cold concrete floor. He couldn't see Emily or Mark, but he felt them, heard their shallow breathing, sensed their fear pressing against his own. A low hum filled the space, vibrating through the walls. It wasn't a sound exactly. It was more like a presence, something vast and watching. The stranger, the man who had warned them, was silent. Daniel didn't know if he was still there, or if he had disappeared into the dark. Then just as suddenly as they had gone out, the lights flickered back on. But something was wrong. The room hadn't changed, but it felt different, like they weren't alone. like something had slipped through the cracks of reality while the lights were off. Mark stood near the door, his body tense, his eyes scanning the room. Emily was beside him, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles were white. The stranger was still there, his face unreadable, but his posture had shifted like he was bracing for something. Then, the door slammed shut. Daniel spun toward it, heart pounding. But no one had moved. No one had touched it. The air grew colder. The hum intensified. And then something shifted. The walls stretched. The shadows twisted. The space around them warped like a mirage, bending and distorting as if reality itself was unraveling. Daniel's pulse hammered. "What's happening?" The stranger exhaled slowly. "It's here." Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "What is?" The stranger turned to face them fully, his eyes colder than before. "The thing that fixes mistakes." The hum grew into a roar. The light overhead flickered violently. The air pulled at them like something unseen was trying to drag them away. Mark stumbled forward, gripping Daniel's arm. "We have to get out of here." But the stranger shook his head. "You don't run from this. You face it." Daniel's mind raced. Face what? There was nothing to fight, nothing to escape from, just a force, something impossible, something that wanted them gone. Then, from the corner of the room, the shadows moved, not flickered, not shifted, moved. They stretched unnaturally, slithering toward them with an intelligence that made Daniel's stomach drop. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but his body refused to move. Emily gasped, stepping back. "That's not possible." The stranger's voice was calm. "None of this is." The shadows lunged. Mark was the first to react, grabbing Emily and pulling her away. But Daniel couldn't move. His feet felt anchored to the ground. The darkness wrapped around him, cold and suffocating, pulling, and then silence. The room snapped back to normal. The lights steadied. The hum disappeared. The shadows retreated as if they had never been there. But something had changed. The stranger exhaled sharply, his eyes locked on Daniel. It let go. Daniel's body trembled. What just happened? The stranger studied him carefully. "It was testing you." Emily shook her head. "Testing for what?" The stranger's gaze didn't waver. "To see if you belong." Mark's voice was sharp. "Belong where?" The stranger hesitated. Then quietly, he said, "Where it came from." A chill ran through Daniel. "You're saying that thing, that force, thought I was one of them?" The stranger nodded. "And for a moment, it almost took you back." Emily's breath hitched. "Back where?" The stranger's expression darkened. "Wherever the ones who don't belong in this world go." Silence stretched between them. The realization settled deep in Daniel's bones. He had survived 2 impossible accidents, not by luck, not by fate, but because something chose him. And now, something else had nearly claimed him. Mark's voice was low. "So what now?" The stranger's lips pressed into a thin line. "Now?" He glanced toward the door. "Now you make a choice." Daniel swallowed hard. "What choice?" The stranger met his eyes. "To keep running, or to finally understand why you were chosen." The air still felt off, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them. Whatever had just tested, Daniel, it wasn't done with him, and deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. Daniel stood there, the stranger's words echoing in his mind. The choice was his to keep running, or finally understand why he had been spared. But the truth was, running had never saved them. It had only led them here, to this moment, to this realization that survival had never been random. Emily's voice broke the silence. "If we stay, do we get answers?" Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were steady. The stranger nodded slowly. Some. Mark exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. And if we leave? The stranger tilted his head. Then you spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering when it will come back for you. A heavy silence settled between them. Daniel's mind raced. Every step of this journey had led them deeper into the unknown, but turning back now? That wasn't an option. He thought about the plane crash, about the feeling of something unseen pulling him toward life when everything else was collapsing. He thought about the people who had disappeared, the strange patterns, the unsettling truth that they weren't supposed to be here. But they were, and that had to mean something. Daniel met the stranger's gaze. I want to know why. Emily hesitated, then nodded. Me too. Mark let out a breath. Guess we're all in this then. The stranger studied them for a long moment, then finally spoke. Then listened carefully. He walked over to the table, pulling out a small battered notebook from his jacket. He flipped through the pages, stopping on one that looked old. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the moment Daniel saw the words, his heart skipped a beat. It was a list. Names. His name. Emily's. Mark's. And then, one name crossed out. Rachel Emily gasped. This is the list of those who survived when they shouldn't have, the stranger finished. The ones who disrupted the sequence. Daniel's throat went dry. Who made this? The stranger's gaze darkened. People who have been watching for a long time. People who understand that balance isn't just an idea, it's a force. And when it's broken, it corrects itself. Mark's voice was sharp. You mean it kills us? The stranger didn't deny it. It restores what was meant to be. Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Then why are we still alive? Stranger hesitated. Then, softly, he said, because something chose you instead. The word sent a chill through him. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. Why us? The stranger closed the notebook. That's the real question. Isn't it? The hum in the air had faded, the room still now, as if whatever presence had been watching them had stepped back. But Daniel knew this wasn't over. Knowing the truth didn't erase it. They had survived against impossible odds, but survival had come with a price. Mark leaned against the wall, shaking his head. So what do we do? Just keep waiting for it to come for us again? The stranger studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, his expression softened. No, you learn. Daniel frowned. Learn what? The stranger exhaled. What? It means to be chosen. A silence stretched between them. Daniel didn't know what that meant, not yet. But he did know one thing, this wasn't about fear anymore. It was about understanding. About figuring out why they had been pulled back from death when others hadn't. Emily looked at Daniel, then at Mark. We stick together, she said firmly. No more running. Mark let out a breath, nodding. Yeah, no more running. The stranger watched them, then gave a small nod. Good. He turned toward the door. Then you might just survive what comes next. Daniel's heart pounded. What does that mean? The stranger didn't answer. He pulled the door open and stepped into the night. And just like that, was gone. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Emily let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. This is insane. Mark rubbed his face. We should be dead. Daniel looked at them, then down at the old notebook left on the table. His fingers traced over his name, over Rachel's name, crossed out. Final. We're not, he said quietly. Emily's voice softened. So what do we do now? Daniel stared at the door where the stranger had disappeared. His mind was still, racing, but deep in his gut, something had shifted. This wasn't about escaping anymore. It was about understanding. "We find out the truth," he said, "no matter what it takes." Outside, the night stretched on, dark and endless. But this time, Daniel wasn't afraid. Because for the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was ready to know.